Now you're going to have to bear with me on this one because this might be the nerdiest, most over-analyzed look into football boots that you've ever seen from me on this channel, which is saying a lot because I've made quite a few videos like that. But it's an idea that I've had written down in my idea book basically since I started this YouTube channel, and I've never actually made the video. Today's going to be that day though. What has always fascinated me about football boots is their impact on performance. And I know that there are those people that will always make the argument that it's the player, not the boots. And I do 100% agree with that. If you're not good, there's no boot that's going to make you into a good player. You have to be good in the first place. And then the boots are kind of an accessory to being good. And at that point, I definitely think that they can make a difference. Obviously, you want them to fit properly. Obviously, you want them to be comfortable. And I definitely think that some football boots are objectively better than others. But there are two main reasons why we wear football boots in the first place. Reason number one is mainly for the traction, which is what we're going to be focusing on in this video. And then obviously number two, aside from comfort, every boot's going to be a little bit different in terms of touch, where that's less objective and more subjective, and that everybody has their own personal preferences. However, everybody wants good traction. Now, the thing that I've always found difficult about reviewing traction is that it's very difficult to differentiate one boot from the next. I think a lot of people recognize that bladed studs versus conical studs are typically going to bite a little bit harder, and this is just going to end up feeling more aggressive, which I think most people would correlate that to being an objectively better stud pattern from a traction standpoint. But what if I told you that maybe there's more of a learning curve from one stud pattern to the next, where yes, this is capable of performing really well, but just by thinking about and learning the stud pattern, you could actually get that much more performance out of it. Now, I realize this might sound a little bit crazy, but I'm going to share with you some logic that I've been thinking about since the age of probably 13, 14 years old that could actually help you get better traction out of your football boots. So if you want to learn more, please stick around and watch the entire video. If you do end up enjoying it, please support it with a like. That helps me out a lot. And if you're not subscribed to the channel already and don't want to miss out on weekly videos on everything football boots, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, I want to specify that this video is in reference mainly to firm ground stud patterns, so the molded plastic studs. There are also soft ground stud patterns and AG stud patterns. Soft ground ones have less variety because they're always based mainly on the 6 main screw-in studs, with some plastic ones around them. But those 6 studs are going to be pretty consistent from one stud pattern to the next in terms of overall traction and feel. And then with AG stud patterns, while there's lots of variety, the artificial grass playing surface itself is very consistent and pretty much clings to anything. So there's just not as much variety there. But I do think that all of this advice can apply to any stud pattern on pretty much any football boot. With that said, with a firm ground stud pattern, basically what allows for good or bad traction is the way that it interacts with the playing surface, where each of these studs is designed to dig into the ground, hold your foot in that specific spot, allowing you to push off with a certain amount of force, which is basically causing you not to slip in the first place. If you have better traction, you're going to accelerate more quickly, you're going to slow down more quickly, you're going to change direction more quickly. These are all things that are very important. So just to give you guys an example and a bit of a visual, I have 2 of the most popular football boots on the market right now, the Adidas X and the Nike Mercurial, in the form of the Superfly and the X19.1. Now, with the FG stud patterns, you can see that the layouts are obviously very different in terms of the exact positioning of the studs. In the heel, you're going to notice that there are 4 on both, so that is similar. But of course, the shape of the studs are also very different. You kind of have a triangular shape here on the X and more of like an arrow chevron shape to the Mercurials, both at the heel as well as in the forefoot. Now, what difference does this actually make? I think most people who have tried both of these boots would pretty much unanimously agree that the Mercurial stud pattern feels like it digs into the ground better and offers simply more aggressive traction, meaning that when you push off, it feels like you are not slipping at all, or at least slipping less versus what you'd find with the X19.1, because that's ultimately, I think, what you're looking for from a traction standpoint. You want to be pushing off as hard as possible in order to propel yourself forward, or whenever direction it may be. Maybe it's just to decelerate. You're trying to do all of these things as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So having better traction is obviously very important. Now, what makes these two stud patterns perform different? And again, we have to talk about how the boots interact with the playing surface. For me, when you're talking about just simply sprinting in a straight direction, which I think is what a lot of people are very much concerned about, you have to think about what part of your foot is coming in contact with the ground. And this is again where it varies from person to person, which is why I think it's super important that you kind of learn your stud pattern and think about what you're doing, because some people run a little bit more flat-footed, some people run on the balls of their feet, some people are very much up on their toes. And with these two football boots, even though they're both categorized as speed boots, if you look at just the placement of the stud in proximity to the very tip of the toe, you'll notice that on the Mercurials, they're much closer to the tip of the toe. And you also have to consider the backside of the stud, because that's the part that's really going to be providing your traction. That's what's digging in, that's what you're pushing off of, these two studs if you're on the tip of your toe. So not only are these a little bit forward, which allow you to increase that angle, which could technically, depending on how you run, allow you to accelerate a little bit more quickly, but they're also a lot more aggressive in terms of their shape. So they're going to penetrate the ground more easily because of the smaller profile. Think of trying to drive a peg into the ground. If it's a narrower peg, you can drive it in more easily, where if it's a giant log, you can't really make that dig into the ground. It's an extreme example, but I think you get what I'm saying, where again, if you ran maybe a little bit more on the balls of your feet and you're looking for maximum traction, you want to involve as many studs as possible. And just look at these two boots. If you want to involve the front four studs on the Mercurial, look how much further forward they are. It's much easier to get the involvement and recruitment of those studs when pushing off, where with the X boots, you can see that obviously you're going to have this stud lined up with these ones as well. So technically you would have 5 in comparison to 4, depending on your foot placement. But obviously your foot placement needs to be a lot more on the balls of your forefoot versus up on your toes when you're comparing these two boots. So if you were trying to run a certain way in a Mercurial, if you were immediately to change into a pair of X's, you're automatically, just based on the shape and positioning of the studs, going to have less studs in contact with the playing surface, which in turn results in worse traction. Just to get a better idea of what I'm talking about, get your boots, put them on, go out on the pitch, and then just stand about shoulder width apart and then kind of shift your weight around where you can feel all of the studs digging in as you shift your weight towards the toe, down the side of the forefoot, in the heel, back around, left foot, right foot. You can actually feel the studs individually digging in, and each of those studs digging in is basically where maximum traction is happening underneath your feet. So what I'm saying here is there's a big difference between just running and changing direction and stopping, and running and changing direction and stopping while being conscious of what is actually providing the traction underneath your feet in the first place. If you're aware of where all the studs are underneath your feet and aware of which parts of the stud patterns need to be recruited in order to offer maximum traction given the specific situation, you have effectively learned your stud pattern. I really do feel like that puts you in a better position to get maximum traction at all times out of your football boot, which in turn will result in better overall performance. I guess my point in all this is that there needs to be a level of self-analysis in terms of the boots that you're wearing and the way that you actually move. I know that everybody wants to be super fast in a straight line, but if that's not necessarily your game, if that's not a movement that you're frequently doing, then it's probably not something that is best to prioritize. What I would personally recommend with any new pair of football boots, if you're finding that you're slipping in the same way very frequently, you probably just need to change the angle of your foot ever so slightly so you can recruit more studs underneath your feet, which is going to result in better, more consistent traction. Ultimately, on a natural grass playing surface, there is the variable of the surface itself where somebody could have stepped there previously, the ground has been loosened up a little bit, and you just end up slipping because what you thought was under your feet isn't actually there. That is kind of sports in general. You can't necessarily predict everything. Slipping is kind of part of the game. But I definitely think through a little bit of thought and just making sure that you are putting your foot on the ground in such a way that's going to allow for the best possible situation in terms of traction. That's the aspect of stud patterns that I don't think a lot of people think about. And if we want to dive even deeper into this, if it wasn't nerdy enough already, we can talk about how sole plates can also impact traction. Now, I think the trend with a lot of football boots, especially speed boots, use the Mercurial as an example, they go for something that has this kind of responsive sprint spring back effect, which is good. I think there's benefit to that in terms of energy transfer, and it does offer a certain feel that actually make you run more quickly. I think that is up for debate, but there's a lot of people that really like this, including my good friend J Mike from the Unisport channel, who I do the Boot Nerds podcast with. Now, while I really like this stud pattern, I think it works quite well. The sole plate also, I think, works well with the stud pattern. I've always been a big fan of more flexible sole plates, and I think when I say something like that, a lot of people automatically assume that that's more of a preference when it comes to comfort. And while that is partially true, if we look at something like this, the Mizuno Rebula 3, the sole plate on this boot is one that I've talked about many times before, in that I think it's one of the best designed sole plates on the market. And the reason for that is not only does it feel structurally sound, it doesn't feel like it's soft or flimsy in any way at all, but it moves very naturally with your foot. And again, this is viewed as a comfort thing, but if you think about it, when you're running, when you're making changes of direction, when you're just playing the sport in general, your foot's contorting, the boot is twisting. You want that boot to move and be as connected to the bottom of your foot as possible. And the more able the football boot is able to move with your foot, that means you're going to have more studs under your feet. And I'm not a scientist. I'm sitting here in my basement surrounded by football boots talking about things that I have been thinking about in my head since I was 14 years old. So I don't have any proof of what I'm about to say, but I'm sure there is studies that these big brands have done that would back up what I'm saying. And I just think that logically it makes sense. But if you were pushing off and you had 2 studs in contact with the surface versus having 4 studs in contact with the surface, I have to assume that having more studs underneath your feet digging into the ground is going to result in better overall traction. And if the sole plate is more flexible, it's going to allow for more studs to be underneath your feet when pushing off or doing whatever movement you might be doing, which in turn is going to result in better traction. I'm going to leave you guys with this to think about. What is often talked about, especially when it comes to elite level athletes and sports in general, is that every millimeter counts. That's the difference between a good player and a great player. And I think that's a very true statement in a lot of ways, but what a lot of people don't take into consideration is the equipment side of things, where it's a necessary part of the sport, but it's not something that's necessarily going to make or break you. And that is true, but I think it's impossible to argue that it doesn't matter at all, because it definitely plays a part in terms of your ability to perform. And when you're talking about traction in a sport like football, it is extremely important. And even though seeing somebody slip is kind of the extreme side of traction, if you can have that little bit more traction when pushing off, that can propel you forward that little bit more quickly. Those couple millimeters from making that change could make a big difference. So what I'm saying in this video is, depending on your football boots, depending on how you move, if you're pushing off in such a way where you're recruiting only 2 studs under your feet, rather than making a very subtle adjustment that wouldn't take you long to learn in training to recruit 5 studs instead of 2, your potential for performance, your potential for traction is increased because of that little change that you've made, where you're now benefiting from the equipment more than you were before. Is this going to make that difference? I guess that's a matter of opinion. But for me, somebody that maybe overanalyzes this to me is something that I would love to see tested. I legitimately believe in my head that this is something that can make a difference. And hopefully, if you're watching this, if you've made it to this point in the video, because I'm sure a lot of people have clicked off, hopefully this is information that you can use and get legitimately better performance out of your football boots and your stud pattern. Anyways, guys, that's it for this one. I hope you learned something. I hope you don't think I'm crazy, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If that was the case, please support it with a like. It helps me out tremendously. If you have any questions regarding any of these theories or just things that I talked about in general, feel free to ask them down below in the comments, and I'll do my best to get an answer out to you. If you are not subscribed to the channel already, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you get notified when the next new video goes live. You can find all my social media information linked down below in the description as well. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.